these tanks are, of course, much more sophisticated than those tanks the German army and the Soviet army had 40 years ago. And today, all our forces in Central Europe are fully mechanized forces. But in those days, we had only about 10% Panzer, tank, or mechanized forces on both sides. And still, these 10% bore the brunt of the battle. Their tactics were decisive for the outcome of many operations, especially the defensive operations. And therefore, I think, even 40 years later, it is quite appropriate to study not only the theoretical, doctrinal principles of those tactics, but also the skills, the practical skills of commanders and troops, of those commanders and troops who stem for more than 4 years the tide of this numerically vastly superior enemy.
The German army, which inflicted lightning defeats on Poland in September 1939 and Western Europe in June 1940, was spearheaded by panzer forces which had been in existence for only 4 years. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 had prohibited the development of modern offensive weapons by Germany after World War I, and so the first 3 panzer divisions formed in 1935 were disguised as motor demonstration commands, and the first tank as a light agricultural tractor. This did not prevent far-sighted officers, such as Colonel Heinz Guderian, from studying the writings of leading British exponents of armoured warfare, Fuller and Little Hart. He used armoured cars, motorcycles, anti-tank guns and dummy tanks in exercises which may have looked primitive, but were vital in developing command and control techniques, particularly radio. The first 3 models of German tanks were all lightly armed and lightly armoured. However, the Panzer IV weighed 18 tons and had a top speed of 35 kilometers per hour. Its gun was the somewhat inaccurate short-barreled 75mm. Despite its shortcomings, it became the standard tank of the German army and remained in production until the end of the Second World War. While the Germans were experimenting with dummy tanks, the Soviets had already begun creating powerful armored forces. By 1932, Soviet industry was turning out 3,000 armored fighting vehicles per month. By 1935, the Red Army already possessed 4 mechanized corps, each with 1 rifle and 2 tank divisions. However, Soviet armor made a poor showing in the Spanish Civil War, and it was decided to disband the unwieldy tank corps. The winter war against Finland was another disaster and gave the Germans an exaggerated view of the Red Army's incompetence. Before the tank corps could be completely disbanded, they were given a reprieve. In June 1940, German panzer formations cut a swathe across Western Europe, and even the powerful French army and British Expeditionary Force could not halt them. In July 1940, in response to the German victories, the Red Army ordered the formation of 29 tank corps, each with 1,000 or more tanks. However, not a single one of these new tank corps had completed its formation by the time the Germans struck. For example, the 14th Tank Corps of the Western Military District, formed in March 1941 with an establishment of 1,023 tanks, including the new heavy KV and medium T-34, could only field 508 tanks, most of which were worn-out T-26s. In June 1941, the Soviet Union had about 5 million men under arms. 3 million of these were to be found in the 170 formations and supporting units deployed in the west of the country. The Air Force, which was not a separate arm, had 1,500 modern planes and thousands of obsolete ones. Soviet Russia's western borders ran 4,500 kilometers from the Barents Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The 3,375 kilometers of land frontier was defended by 56 divisions to a depth of about 50 kilometers. The second echelon, containing most of the tank formations, was to be found anywhere from 50 to 100 kilometers behind the frontier. The reserves, which also included a number of mechanized corps, were deployed from 150 to 400 kilometers from the frontier. At the outbreak of World War II, in September 1939, the German army had 70 active divisions, 13 of which were classified as motorized. The 5 panzer divisions were each composed of a panzer brigade with 2 panzer regiments, each with 2 panzer battalions, each with 4 companies of light tanks, and a motorized infantry brigade with 2 rifle regiments, each with 2 battalions. In 1940, the number of panzer divisions was doubled, but the tank strength of each was halved by reducing the number of light and medium tanks and replacing them by fewer, heavier models with increased firepower. The infantry component was increased, and this made a more balanced formation. Before dawn on the 22nd of June 1941, 152 German divisions, including 19 panzer and 14 motorized divisions, and 29 satellite divisions, totaling some 5.5 million men, invaded the Soviet Union. This huge force was divided into 3 army groups, spearheaded by the panzer divisions. Army Group North, von Leeb, was to advance northeastwards to Leningrad, while its northern flank was to trap Soviet forces with their backs to the Baltic Sea. Army Group Center, von Bock, was to take the most direct route from Brest-Litovsk to Smolensk over the river Dnieper, and either north to Leningrad or straight on to Moscow, a distance, as the crow flies, of 1,000 kilometers. Army Group South, von Rundstedt, was to advance with its 600 tanks on Kiev and the Dnieper Valley and destroy all Soviet forces between the Pripyat marshes and the Black Sea.
Es ging früh um 4 Uhr ging der Artillerieangriff los und wir sind ungefähr zwischen 6 und 7 Uhr früh über diese Brücke gefahren, die von der Infanterie eingenommen worden war. Es war kein sehr großer Feindwiderstand. Es waren einige leichte russische Panzer da, Schwimmpanzer, die für uns alle kein Problem bedeuteten. Wir sind ziemlich zügig vorwärts gefahren in Richtung nach Berdychev, was das Angriffsziel war. Und wir haben kaum geschlafen, das ging eigentlich Tag und Nacht durch mit Luftwaffenunterstützung, bis wir vor Berdychev auf die ersten T-34 stießen.
Meine Gedanken beim Überschreiten der russischen Grenze waren wie folgt. Wir waren eine sehr erfahrene alte Panzerdivision, hatten in Polen und in Frankreich gekämpft und fühlten uns überlegen über jeden Gegner. Die Russen waren für uns kein wirklicher Gegner. Dieser Eindruck änderte sich sehr schnell am allerersten Tage. Wir gingen bei Tauroggen über die Grenze und dort trafen wir auf die russischen Grenzschutzverbände, die so hart fochten, dass wir am Mittag des ersten Tages schon alle Munition in den Panzer IV verschossen hatten.
In the first days of war, German forces were advancing very swiftly, and this put the entire staff of the Red Army in a state of shock, as it were. This state of shock stayed with us for quite a long time. As far as I know, the Soviets weren't organized to fight until July or even the beginning of August. This was in the region of Staraya Russa, to the west of Novgorod. But before that, let's say in July, the Soviet army was retreating in such chaos that reconnaissance of the northwestern front had to send special detachment to find out not where the enemy was positioned, but where the Soviet units, their own army, was.
Air superiority was another decisive factor. By midday on the 22nd of June 1941, the Luftwaffe had attacked 66 airfields and destroyed some 800 aircraft on the ground. Thereafter, the Germans enjoyed almost complete air superiority. As the armored spearheads penetrated deeper into Soviet territory, they began to experience not only increasingly bitter resistance, but the other problems of waging war in Russia. Vast distances, heat, dust, exhaustion, and wear and tear on vehicles and equipment. In many ways, the Soviet Union was an ideal country for armored warfare. But the enormous distances lowered the morale of the infantrymen who had to march most of the way, so that the foot soldier often went into battle already exhausted. Russia had many roads, but only one metalled highway from Brest-Litovsk to Moscow. The other roads were little more than tracks. The wooden bridges which crossed the many streams and rivers were often too weak to take the weight of heavy military traffic. The Soviet railway system left much to be desired. Since the tracks were a wider gauge, every kilometer of line had to be narrowed. The few railheads assumed considerable strategic and tactical importance. Once supplies had been offloaded, they might then have to be transported as much as 500 kilometers by road to the front. By the autumn of 1941, the Red Army had suffered a series of shattering defeats and encirclements, and its losses in material and men were astronomical.
Поэтому нужно сказать, что мораль была настолько низкая.
The morale of the troops was so low that at the beginning of the war, some Soviet divisions and even some armies encircled by the Germans didn't even try to fight back, but gave themselves up. Never before in the whole history of Russia had anyone seen full-blooded, fully armed divisions or corps surrender without a shot being fired.
At this critical phase of the operation, when the Germans had reached the line Leningrad, Smolensk, Kiev, there was a conflict of opinion. Hitler became increasingly concerned with the economic and political objectives, such as the far-off Caucasian oil fields and the Ukrainian cornfields. The field commanders insisted that the first priority must be the destruction of the Red Army. The generals, particularly Guderian, wanted to press on to Moscow, but 3 vital weeks passed before Hitler finally decided on the Ukraine. The Panzer forces were redeployed in the Ukraine, and Army Group South, reinforced by Guderian's tanks, advanced into the Crimea. The offensive against Moscow was finally resumed on the 30th of September 1941. The sudden switch took the Soviets by surprise, and soon huge Red Army forces found themselves encircled at Bryansk and Vyazma. When, on the 16th of October, these pockets surrendered, Army Group Center had taken 1.5 million prisoners since the beginning of the campaign. The way to Moscow appeared to be wide open. But when the first ominous fall of snow suddenly melted, the roads dissolved into a quagmire, and the German advance was reduced to an average of 12 kilometers a day.
Es war so viel und so tiefer Schlamm, dass man außer mit großen Zugmaschinen nicht fahren konnte. Also Panzer konnten fahren, Zugmaschinen konnten fahren, aber kein LKW mit Sprit oder Munition. Es war also keine Möglichkeit vorzukommen. Daraufhin mussten wir warten, bis der Grund wieder gefroren war. Und als der Frost anfing, sind wir dann nach Moskau gestartet. Und wir sind ziemlich zügig vorangekommen bis zum Straßenkreuz nördlich Moskau, ungefähr 25 Kilometer von Moskau entfernt. Und da setzte dann eine eisige Kälte ein, einmal, und dann auch ein sehr starker russischer Widerstand. Und die Kälte war so groß, dass unsere Panzer praktisch unbeweglich wurden dabei.
Er war der kälteste Russlandwinter überhaupt mit Temperaturen von über 40 Grad. Und wenn man berücksichtigt, dass wir zu der Zeit überhaupt keinerlei Winterklamotten hatten, war der Winter besonders schlimm. Was die Fahrzeuge betraf, so hatten wir Schwierigkeiten, die allmorgendlich überhaupt zum Anspringen zu bringen. Wir mussten teilweise unter dem Motor ein Feuer entfachen, weil auch mit dem Schwungkraftanlasser die Wagen sonst nicht zu starten gewesen wären. Alles war zu fest gewesen im Öl.
The Germans had fought their way over 900 kilometers, and Moscow was just 30 kilometers away when on the 6th of December 1941, with temperatures below minus 30 degrees centigrade, the offensive was called off. The Soviet Supreme Command sensed that the Germans had shot their bolt, and with reinforcements arriving from the Far East, the Red Army went on to the offensive.
Das Traurige für uns und das Erstaunliche war, dass die Russen mit ihren T-34 die Kälte überhaupt nicht beachteten. Die sibirischen Divisionen, die kamen hier nach Europa und schüttelten sich und sagten, bruh, wie warm, und bekämpften uns. Der Rückzug machte uns natürlich deprimierter, als wir sowieso schon waren. Zum ersten Mal fühlten wir, dass wir geschlagen wurden.
In appalling weather, and despite Hitler's categoric order not to give up a single meter of Soviet territory, the Germans were pushed back until they were able to establish a line east of Smolensk, south to the Meuse River. There they remained until operations could be resumed again in the spring. Despite the optimism which continued to prevail in the Führer's headquarters, not one of Hitler's primary objectives had been attained. Leningrad and Moscow had not fallen, while in the south much of the Ukraine lay beyond Germany's reach. In many ways, the Soviets had contributed to their own defeats during the first months of the campaign. By attempting a linear defense of every kilometer of their vast frontier, they had spread out their forces so that the Germans were always able to achieve overwhelming superiority in the areas of their main effort. By placing their reserves so far back, rudimentary communications, bad roads, lack of motor transport and inexperienced commanders meant that they were easily outfought by more flexible and mobile German forces.
Система управления в советских полках и дивизиях.
The whole command system of Soviet regiments and divisions is based on the principle of very strict subordination from top to bottom. That extremely strict subordination existed before the war, so the whole of the officer corps was trained to execute very precisely the orders received from above. But just before the war, many senior officers had been liquidated in Stalin's purges, and the newly promoted senior officers were quite unprepared to show initiative. Anyhow, they were not expected to show initiative. On the contrary, it was forbidden by military regulations, which specified that each officer and each man was only to execute the orders of his immediate superior. Initiative was considered risky.
Those commanders that survived were mostly Stalin's old favorites, like the Russian Civil War heroes Budyonny, Voroshilov and Timoshenko, who were completely out of their depth when it came to marshalling vast armies in the era of the tank. The Germans had to come to terms with the fact that in the T-34, the Soviets possessed an armored fighting vehicle which was far superior to anything they had.
Ich war damals Gefreiter in einem Panzer II, der sowieso Panzer nicht abschießen konnte. Und im Kessel von Uman sahen wir zum ersten Mal T-34 und waren begreiflicherweise erstaunt, was das für Panzer sind. Vor allen Dingen die Qualität der Panzerung und der Konstruktion, sodass diese Panzer praktisch nur frontal von der 8,8 Flak und von der Seite von 5 cm oder 7,5 abgeschossen werden konnte. Also zum Beispiel 3,7 Pack konnte dem mehr oder weniger gar nichts anhaben.
Wir mussten uns darauf einstellen, dass wir mit den zur Panzerbekämpfung dienenden Waffen, der 3,7 Kampfwagenkanone und der 5 cm Kampfwagenkanone, den T-34 praktisch nicht erledigen konnten. Unsere schweren Kompanien mit der 7,5 cm Kanone entdeckte, mehr durch Zufall, dass die Sprenggranaten, wenn sie insbesondere mit einer Viertelsekunde Verzögerung auf das Heck des T-34 geschossen wurden, entweder die darauf befindlichen Dieselölfässer zum Brennen brachten oder aber durch den Feuerschlag, der in die Gratings für die Ansaugluft hereinging, im Motorraum eine Entzündung verursachten.
During the early months of 1942, the Germans formed another 4 panzer divisions, giving them an actual strength of 3,300 tanks on the Eastern Front in May 1942. Armoured personnel carriers were still in short supply, however, and only 1 grenadier battalion in each panzer division was equipped with them, despite their new designation of Panzer Grenadiers. The other battalions continued to travel in lorries. The point of maximum effort of the 1942 German summer offensive was in the Kursk region. Army Group B, with 3 armies and 4th Panzer Army, was to head for the Don, then swing south along its banks, encircling as many Soviet divisions as it could in the river's great bend between Rostov and Voronezh. The Soviets, expecting the offensive to be resumed against Moscow, were taken by surprise when, on the 28th of June 1942, 800 tanks and assault guns of 4th Panzer Army broke through their lines in the Ukraine and struck across the rolling plains to the River Don. As always, the Luftwaffe played a key role. It had been ordered to support only the armoured spearheads, and an officer in Luftwaffe uniform was often to be found up amongst the leading tanks.
Man muss unterscheiden zwischen dem sogenannten Flibo und dem Stuka-Leitoffizier. Die Aufgabe des Flibos beim Korps bestand hauptsächlich darin, die Korpsführung von allem zu unterrichten, was die Luftwaffe durchführte, beziehungsweise der Korpsführung von Nutzen sein konnte in der Beurteilung der Lage. Während der Stuka-Leitoffizier immer an der Front war, meist bei Panzerspitzen. Der Stuka-Leitoffizier hatte sich meist morgens im Morgengrauen an den Brennpunkt des Geschehnisses gesetzt mit seinem Panzer. Hinter dem Panzer wurde eine etwa 1,5 Meter tiefe Grube in Pfeilform gegraben und in diese Grube wurde ein orange Tuch gelegt, damit die Sturzkampfflieger, die im Anflug waren, dass sowohl unsere Hauptkampflinie wie auch das feindliche Ziel besser erkennen konnten.
Ich entsinne mich an eine für uns sehr unangenehme Situation, wo wir gegen einen russischen Panzerabwehrriegel aus T-34 und Packflak aufliefen. Und zwar auf einem Gelände, wo wir uns so schnell gar nicht in Deckung begeben konnten. Da hat der Fliegerverbindungsoffizier, der ja in derselben gefährdeten Situation war, sofort die Stukas heruntergeholt. Und ehe das Panzerbataillon noch richtig reagieren konnte, hatten die Stukas den Waldrand, in dem die Panzerabwehrfront der Russen war, mit ihren Bomben belegt, sodass die Gefahr für uns ausgeschaltet war.
The Panzer Army also had direct control over its reconnaissance flights and used them to seek out Soviet troop movements in plenty of time to plan the most effective countermeasures. Momentum was maintained despite Soviet attempts to strike at 4th Panzer Army's exposed flank as it sped towards Stalingrad on the River Volga with very little resistance, when Hitler made a fatal decision. He ordered the 4th to swing south and assist 1st Panzer Army in its crossing of the River Don. On the 23rd of July, the Germans took Rostov, gateway to the Caucasus. When, 2 weeks later, 4th Panzer Army resumed its advance on Stalingrad, the Soviets had just scraped together sufficient forces to hold the Germans and their allies on the outskirts of the city. The name alone, Stalin's City, was enough to ensure its special significance in Hitler's eyes, although the town itself had no strategic importance. By committing the 6th Army to the storming of Stalingrad, Hitler deprived his soldiers of their one advantage, mobility, while pitting them against the inadequately trained but dogged adversary, the Red Army infantrymen. On the 14th of October 1942, Hitler brought to a close the summer offensive by halting all operations except those on the southern sector in the Caucasus and around Stalingrad. In November 1942, the front line ran from Leningrad in the north to Rzhev, Oryol, and along the River Don to Stalingrad, and then south to the Caucasus Mountains and the Black Sea east of Novorossiysk. However, the Red Army was still in the field and even beginning to grow in strength, whereas the German army in the east was nearing the end of its offensive capabilities. Its losses were approaching the 2 million mark, and the survivors were battle-weary. Vehicles and equipment were in need of maintenance, while the armaments industry was only just able to replace battle losses. For both Hitler and Stalin, the Battle of Stalingrad assumed symbolic significance far in excess of its strategic importance. In purely military terms, the main German objective was to deprive the Soviets of their supply arteries of the rivers Don and Volga, and this could have been done without taking Stalingrad itself. Rather than eliminate Soviet bridgeheads on the west bank of the Volga, above and below Stalingrad, the 6th Army was committed to a battle of attrition in the city's rubble. The Luftwaffe was so committed to the Battle of Stalingrad that the Soviets were able to build up reserves without having to contend with Luftwaffe interference. To prevent German forces exerting additional pressure on the city's defenders, the Soviets resumed activity on 6th Army's flanks during September 1942. Throughout October, the fighting in the city rose in intensity until, by the 20th, the remaining pockets of Soviet resistance had been pushed back to within 1,000 meters of the banks of the Volga. But during that critical month, the Soviet High Command was planning a counteroffensive, codenamed Uran. It began to assume the shape of a single strategic operation along a 300-kilometer-long front involving the Stalingrad, Don, and southwestern fronts, each of which was roughly equivalent to a German army group. The southwestern front was to break through the sector of the line held by the Romanians between Serafimovic and Kletskaya and head southeast for Kalach. 3 days were allowed for this 100-kilometer advance. The Stalingrad front was to launch its attack from the Sarepta Lakes against the Romanian line and converge on Kalach, where it was to link up with the southwestern front, thus cutting off the enemy between the rivers Volga and Don. Its left flank was to attack in the direction of Kotelnikovo. The Don front was to launch simultaneous offensives from its Kletskaya bridgehead and destroy the German forces in the small bend of the Don. The Germans and their allies, strung out along the 400-kilometer-long front on the River Don, were not so much an army group as a group of armies. South of Stalingrad was the 4th Romanian Army, while way out in the steppe near Elista was the 16th Panzer Grenadier Division. In and around Stalingrad itself were the 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army. From the city northwards to Kursk were the 3rd Romanian, 8th Italian, 2nd Hungarian, and 2nd German armies. In reserve, behind the sector held by the 3rd Romanian Army, was the 48th Panzer Corps. Its panzer divisions were to play the key role in the defensive fighting along the Teschir River. Otherwise, there were no significant German reserves and little hope of reinforcements. By November 1942, the Romanian troops on the Don were at the end of a march which had taken them across the Ukraine and Bessarabia to the Black Sea, where for 2 months they had laid siege to Odessa. During that journey, they had lost 130,000 of their comrades.
Sie waren einwandfrei überfordert.
They were clearly overtaxed by the Russian assault. As far as equipment and training were concerned, they were not in a position to resist a concentrated Russian tank attack. Moreover, behind them there were hardly any reserves, so that the collapse on these fronts could have been forecast.
General Karl Adolf Hollit, commander of Army Detachment Hollit, was also well aware of the danger.
I
remember leaving the main headquarters, the Führer headquarters, with an officer and saying to him, "Now have a look at this. We are surrounded right and left by foreign soldiers. Our allies are the Romanians, and then the Italians, and the Hungarians are beyond the Romanians. They don't all measure up to the German troops. They can't, because they haven't got the same experience. And above all, they haven't the same armament. And I am telling you, this could conceivably cause difficulties. So I don't trust these allies one little bit." And the officer said to me, "Don't let the Führer, Adolf Hitler, hear that." And then I got really cheeky and said, "If he doesn't want to hear it, then he will soon feel it."
During the first week of November, as the Germans prepared to renew their efforts to take Stalingrad, Soviet forces began to move into their forming up positions for Operation Uran. The marshalling of this tremendous force, while the fighting for Stalingrad still raged, was in itself an incredible achievement. 1.5 million men, 13,500 guns, 894 tanks, and 1,115 aircraft. Ferrying men and equipment across the wide Don and Volga rivers and deploying and concealing them in the open steppe was a hazardous operation. Increased Soviet air activity during the infrequent periods of good flying weather reduced German air reconnaissance significantly. On the eve of the Soviet counteroffensive, German and Soviet forces along the 700-kilometer southern sector were roughly equal. But by stripping other formations, the Soviets were able to build up significant superiority, particularly against Germany's ill-equipped allies. Operation Uran began at 0720 on the 19th of November, when the southwestern and Don fronts broke out of their bridgeheads and struck the line weakly held by the Romanian Third Army. Initially, the Soviet rifle divisions, with their weak armored complement, were held by the Romanians. But massed Soviet armor broke through their flanks and drove out into the steppe beyond. Despite appalling weather and poor visibility, both the Stalingrad and southwestern fronts had penetrated deep into 6th Army's eastern flank and were 30 kilometers in the German rear. At 1400 hours on the 23rd of November, troops of the southwestern and Stalingrad fronts linked up at Kalach. This initial encirclement trapped 270,000 German and Allied troops of the 6th Army in the Stalingrad pocket, an area 57 kilometers west to east and 35 kilometers north to south. The most important task now for the Soviet southwestern and southern fronts was to strengthen the 160-kilometer-long outer encirclement of Stalingrad by building up a strong front so that German efforts to relieve Stalingrad from 6th Army's first reaction on being encircled was to break out to the west. But on the 24th of November, Hitler ordered General Paulus to stay put, having been assured by Goering that the Luftwaffe could keep the 6th Army supplied from the air. On the same day, encouraged by its initial success, Soviet High Command decided to extend Operation Uran and began to plan Operation Saturn. This called for the left wing of the Voronezh front, with 60% of the entire Soviet armored forces, to launch an offensive in the direction of Rostov, with the object of cutting off Army Group A in the Caucasus and on the Don. On the 26th of November, Field Marshal von Manstein was appointed commander of a new Army Group Don, which consisted of the remnants of 6th Army, the 4th Panzer Army, and the 3rd Romanian Army. His task was to coordinate the defenses on the flanks of the 6th Army in Stalingrad. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was born in Berlin on the 24th of November, 1897. He was commissioned into the Prussian Foot Guards in 1906, and during the First World War served on both the eastern and western fronts. Between the wars, he held several General Staff appointments, and in October 1936 was promoted Major General. In July 1942, in recognition of his superb generalship, which had contributed so much to Germany's victories, Hitler promoted him Field Marshal.
He was the typical commander of the old school, who, during the First World War, commanded from far in the rear, far removed from the actual events of the fighting and from weather conditions and hardships, but who could nevertheless make the right strategic decisions. In this respect, he differed fundamentally from the more tactical troop commanders such as Model or Rommel or Guderian. But even so, with his outstanding strategic talents, he was one among very few comparable commanders-in-chief and battle arbiters of the Second World War.
Chief of the General Staff was General Zeitzler, and his deputy for operations was Lieutenant General Heusinger. For the whole of the Eastern Front, there were only 14 General Staff officers dealing with operational matters. Central to the system of command in the Prussian-German army was the concept of Auftragstaktik, or orders by directive.
Ever since I became a soldier, and that was in the summer of 1909, my experience has been that subordinate commanders in our army were trained to look after themselves, to act on their own initiative, and to make their own decisions. This has been my experience throughout my entire military life. And it was also taken to heart in the First World War, and it paid off. In particular, the point about subordinates using their initiative, which was put into practice and used in the training of the Reichswehr. Our army at that time, under Colonel General von Seeckt.
The objective of every military operation is the destruction of the adversary. As this can be changed by conducting the fighting in various ways according to a particular situation, the senior commanders, that is to say the divisional commanders and above, must be let free to choose the method of fighting. They received a directive, and this was known as Auftragstaktik. Commanders of companies, battalions and regiments in general received orders which usually went into detail.
Since the beginning of the war, formation commanders often led from the front and took important decisions on the spot. They were usually found forward where the major effort was being made.
When the commander was with the troops, as was normal almost every day, the chief of staff had to maintain contact over the combat area, both with the divisions under corps command and with the senior army headquarters above him. But as has already been said, if decisions were necessary because of the changing situation, the chief of staff also had to be able to deal with changes in the steps taken by the corps and had to give the corresponding orders to the divisions by telephone.
Flexible command, which encouraged initiative, and a highly developed tactical communications net were in stark contrast to the rigid textbook approach of the Soviets. It was not easy to command armor flexibly when tank commanders had to rely on visual signaling to convey their orders. If von Manstein was to attempt to relieve the encircled 6th Army, it was essential that his forces remain as close to Stalingrad as possible. And so throughout December, the Soviets exerted enormous pressure on the German and Allied forces between the rivers Don and Teschir in their efforts to extend the outer ring as far to the west as possible. The Teschir line was held by makeshift units composed of remnants of the 3rd Romanian Army, German infantry, ad hoc alarm units made up of rear service personnel and Luftwaffe field divisions. These divisions were created by Goering from surplus Air Force personnel. They were well equipped but lacked training and were commanded by officers with no experience of ground combat. On the 2nd of December 1942, 48th Panzer Corps ordered its infantry to form a defensive line along the Teschir by constructing strong points in depth, not linear. The strong points for all-round defense were to be manned by at least a platoon. Individual soldiers were to be deployed between the strong points to prevent Soviet infiltration. Heavy weapons, which included the 88mm guns, were to be dug in and covered, and alternative positions were to be prepared for them. The Corps headquarters reminded its subordinate commanders of their responsibility to ensure that they established contact with their next highest headquarters. Units were to report in every 2 hours at least, even when all was quiet, because situation unchanged signals were also helpful to Corps headquarters to build up an overall picture of what was happening. The ensuing battle, which developed around the state collective farm, Sovkhoz 79, is a classic example of the superiority of flexible German battle tactics, which time and time again enabled small numbers of well-trained, experienced and well-commanded troops to defeat Soviet forces which outnumbered them between 4 and 8 times. At the beginning of December 1942, the headquarters of 48th Panzer Corps was at Nizhny Teschir, where the Teschir River runs into the Don. Since it was the nearest point to troops of the 6th Army in Stalingrad, it was a vital bridgehead for 4th Panzer Army's attempt to relieve Stalingrad. Elsewhere along the Teschir, the 336th Infantry Division was holding the line from Nizhny Teschir to Surovkino. At the beginning of December, 5th Tank Army began to launch a series of heavy attacks across the Teschir in an attempt to drive the Germans as far away from Stalingrad as possible. On the 7th of December 1942, 11th Panzer Division with 46 tanks was moving up from Rostov. It was then ordered to halt the Soviet 1st Tank Corps, which had crossed the Teschir between Oblivskaya and Surovkino on the left flank of 336th Infantry Division and had advanced to and taken State Collective Farm number 79. After a night march, the 11th Panzer Division's commander, General Balk, using his anti-aircraft guns as anti-tank artillery, placed them south of the farm. The artillery of 336th Infantry Division was to operate on the Panzer Division's northeast flank. 15th Panzer and 111th Panzer Grenadier Regiments advanced undetected along the heights west and north of the farm, while 110th Panzer Grenadier Regiment delivered a holding attack. The Panzers hit the rear of the Soviet tank formations and their supply columns just as they were about to attack the rear of 336th Infantry Division. By the end of the battle, the Soviet 1st Tank Corps had been virtually wiped out with a loss of 50 tanks. German losses were negligible. On the evening of the 11th of December, other Soviet forces broke through the Teschir line at Lysynsky and Nizhny Kalinovsky, which were about 22 kilometers apart. 4th Panzer Army began its attempt to break through to Stalingrad on the 12th of December. Simultaneously, 11th Panzer Division smashed the Soviet breakthrough at Lysynsky and then marched northwest and struck the Soviet forces at Nizhny Kalinovsky and compressed the bridgehead. On the 14th, after a short lull, 11th Panzer Division slipped quietly away from its positions containing the Nizhny Kalinovsky bridgehead and moved to Nizhny Chir, where it was to force a passage over the half-frozen Don to join the left flank of 4th Panzer Army, which was approaching the river Aksai. By the 16th, 4th Panzer Army had fought its way to the Aksai, only 64 kilometers from the nearest troops of the encircled 6th Army. This offensive, launched on the 12th of December, led the Soviets to reconsider their planned major counteroffensive, called Saturn, aimed at Rostov, and to launch Little Saturn, which called for the southwestern front to swing the main axis of its attack from the south to the southeast, and so disrupt the German lines of communication concentrated in the Morozovsk area. Powerful armored forces of the southwestern front crossed the Chir at Ostrovsky and, swinging round to the southeast, headed for Morozovsk. Simultaneously, the Voronezh front swept away the 8th Italian Army on the Middle Don and sped southwards. On the 17th of December, just as 11th Panzer Division was about to cross the Don, reports came in of a Soviet breakthrough in 336th Infantry Division sector, 9 kilometers north of Nizhny Chir. Instead of joining 4th Panzer Army, 11th Panzer Division was committed to eliminating this bridgehead. But while engaged in that task, the dormant bridgehead at Nizhny Kalinovsky suddenly burst into life and presented another dire threat. And the weary division, the only mobile reserve left, set out on another 19-kilometer night march. At 0500 hours on the 19th of December, Panzer Regiment 15 of 11th Panzer Division, with 25 tanks, surprised a Soviet tank force just as it was about to move off. While 110th Panzer Grenadier Regiment blocked its advance, 15th Panzer Regiment fell in behind the Soviet tanks and in a few minutes knocked out 42 vehicles before their crews realized what was happening.
Quite simply, we always had the edge on them, since the Russian army was so very badly led. We gained the impression that no one knew what the other fellow was up to, or what he was supposed to be doing himself. They were just individual tanks milling around. So the secret was to gain as much ground as you could, just as fast as you could, so that the Russians didn't know where they were, or didn't know where our leading tank spearheads were either.
The Panzer Regiment's right flank was guarded by 111th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, which also acted as a reserve force. From high ground, Panzer Regiment 15 spotted another Soviet column moving south and fell in behind it, forming a second echelon. In a few minutes, another 20 tanks were destroyed, making the day's total 65. The back of the Soviet attack was broken, and the shattered remnants fled in a northwesterly direction.
Our communication system also played a role in our successes. At that time, the communication system was so good among the German troops that, without saying who we were by name, We could tell from the voice who was speaking. Of course, this is all part and parcel of the value of getting to know one another. Our communications were comprehensive in scale, they functioned splendidly, and they were so good in their own way that we were able to talk to one another as if we were all sitting around one table during a battle.
Although operations Uran and Little Saturn had failed to achieve all their objectives, the Red Army had inflicted grievous wounds on the Germans and their allies on the Eastern Front. No amount of individual heroism and self-sacrifice could now help the Germans overcome the power and growing confidence of the Red Army.
The Soviet Union is a vast country, so the Soviet Army had plenty of room in which to maneuver. It could retreat for thousands of kilometers to regroup, concentrate its forces, restore the morale of the men, receive Lend-Lease aid from its allies, and return to the attack, a strategic counteroffensive. So the very size of the Soviet Union meant that in spite of great losses, in spite of the fact that a large part of European USSR had been abandoned to the German occupying forces, the Soviet High Command could concentrate its forces, bringing in units from the Far East and from Siberia, to muster them beyond the Volga and then launch the great counterattack which ended in the victory of the Soviet Union.
At the end of 1942, Field Marshal von Manstein found himself confronting the most daunting task of his career. The whole southern sector of the Eastern Front teetered on the brink of disintegration throughout January and February 1943, and it seemed only a matter of time before an even greater disaster than Stalingrad overtook the Axis. However, von Manstein's brilliant handling of the crisis would turn a fighting withdrawal into a counterstroke, restoring the situation and enabling German forces to withdraw from the Caucasus and re-establish a stable front. The Red Army's confidence, boosted by the success of Operation Uran, led to a marked improvement in the quality of leadership now that the initiative had been wrested from the Germans.
Soviet propaganda started appealing to soldiers and officers alike, urging them to defend their country, as the Russian armies of yore had defended it under great generals such as Kutuzov, Suvorov, Nakhimov, Ushakov, and others. The government instituted medals, the Order of Alexander Nevsky, the Order of Suvorov, Kutuzov, and so on. In 1943, they even brought back epaulets, epaulets like those the Imperial Army officers used to wear. This increased the prestige of the officers and, to a certain extent, raised their morale. Soviet propaganda having brought back the regalia of the old Russian army, promised the nation that after the war, life would be better. And that too helped to raise the morale of the troops and the civilians.
At the end of December 1942, the Stalingrad front with 5 armies was encircling the German 6th Army in Stalingrad. The Voronezh front had punched a 150-kilometer wide gap in the sector of the line held by the 8th Italian Army, thus exposing Army Group Don's left flank. The consequences of this were serious. First, 4th Panzer Army's attempt to relieve Stalingrad was called off, thus sealing the fate of the 6th Army. Second, the Soviets were able to close up on the Donets River, the so-called Donets Balcony. The southern front was advancing across the Kalmyk steppe in the direction of Rostov. Von Manstein's grand plan emerged out of the desperate plight of the 3 army groups in southern Ukraine and in the Caucasus. He was convinced that even after the winter battles, the panzer formations could still stabilize the fluid situation if they could be concentrated instead of being scattered all over the front.
Manstein ging es aber im Grunde etwas ganz anderes.
What was at stake, as really in all the earlier and later conferences, was Manstein's consistent pleas for freedom of operation. Freedom of decision on operational possibilities, he used to say, that's where our only chance lies. Hitler's way of thinking, on the other hand, his military way of thinking was static. Hold on to what we've got, never let anything go, consolidate, construct fortifications, don't yield any ground, not an inch of ground.
Von Manstein's aim was to extract as many of the panzer formations as possible and regain the initiative by using them to smash the Soviet forces which were enveloping his left wing. But Hitler thought differently, and in a telephone conversation with von Manstein on the 26th of December said,
Ja, ich wollte Sie über die Lage sprechen. Sie haben...
I want to talk to you about the situation. I see from your daily situation report that you have made a request for troops to be withdrawn from the Caucasus and moved up north and placed under your command for the relief of Stalingrad. I cannot authorize this request.
Kann ich nicht genehmigen. Darauf Manstein, was soll...
Von Manstein countered, what are those troops supposed to be doing up there in the Caucasus with a front to the south? Hitler, we need the oil in Baku.
Baku. Sagt Manstein.
Von Manstein, but first I must restore the situation. I must get the 6th Army out of Stalingrad, or at least re-establish a continuous front. Up there, the troops are completely useless.
Da sagt Hitler, Herr Feldmarschall.
Then Hitler said, Herr Feldmarschall. He never said Herr von Manstein. Herr Feldmarschall, if we cannot keep and hold the oil in Baku, we shall lose the war.
Von Manstein realized that the most serious threat was to the 1st Panzer Army 600 kilometers to the south in the Caucasus. And so it was imperative, despite the severe threat to his left flank, that 4th Panzer Army keep open the Donetsk crossings near Rostov.
The first thing to be settled was the combat tactics of the 4th Panzer Army to the south, in conjunction with a Holland army detachment between the Donets and the Mius. The reason for this was to keep the crossing points at Rostov open for the approaching 1st Panzer Army, and later for the 4th Panzer Army. Secondly, the 1st Panzer Army had to be moved out under the protection of the shield and engage against the enemy, who had already penetrated far to the south across the Donets, deep into our flanks and in our rear. And finally, the 4th Panzer Army had to be moved back through Rostov, in conjunction with a Holland army detachment, and push straight to the north, so as to strike at the enemy forces, which were threatening the Dnieper crossings in the direction of Dnipropetrovsk, and therefore our rearward communications.
After bitter fighting in January, 1st Panzer Army was able to withdraw through Rostov and came under von Manstein's command on the 27th of January. He extracted it from the bitter rearguard actions in which it was involved and used it to shore up his crumbling left flank by attacking any enemy forces which crossed the Donets between Voroshilovgrad and Lysychansk. Von Manstein now moved his headquarters from Taganrog to Stalino, so as to be nearer the assembly area for his counterstroke forces. In Stalingrad, the defenders were making their last stand in the city's Red Square.
Dazu kann ich nur sagen,
about that, I can only say we remained there as ordered. The order was, hold Stalingrad to the last bullet. The dreadful end illustrated the stupidity of that order.
einen großen Erfolg.
A big success, if one can call it a success, was that by sacrificing itself, the Sixth Army tied up 10 Russian armies in this area and held them in check until von Manstein was able to build up a new defense line.
Die neue Verteidigung aufgebaut hatte.
On the 31st of January 1943, the southern sector of Stalingrad, under the personal command of Field Marshal Paulus, surrendered. With the surrender of the German Sixth Army, the main Soviet aim now was the liberation of the Ukraine. To this end, the Voronezh front was to exploit the collapse of Army Group B on the upper Donetsk and retake the industrial area around Kharkov. The southwestern and southern fronts, with 4 armies, were to liberate the coal and steel producing area of the Donetsk basin. The front mobile group, named after its commander, Markian Mikhailovich Popov, was to head for Krasnoarmeysk, 3rd Guards Army for Voroshilovgrad, and 1st Guards Army for Krasny Liman. Popov's group consisted of 4 tank corps, 3 rifle divisions, and 2 independent tank brigades. Its establishment was 500 tanks, but it actually fielded only 137. As the situation worsened, von Manstein asked for permission to withdraw his right wing to the Dnieper and to use the forces thus released to recover his operational freedom. Hitler's response was to dispatch his personal aeroplane to bring von Manstein to his headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia. After grappling with the problem for hours, Field Marshal von Manstein convinced Hitler that the only solution was to withdraw the right flank of Army Group Don to the Mius River, so that 4th Panzer Army could be redeployed from the lower Don to the left flank of 1st Panzer Army, and then used to halt the Soviet offensive between the rivers Donetsk and Dnieper. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, newly arrived from France with 3 fresh and fully equipped Waffen SS Panzer divisions in the Kharkov area, was to move south so that all panzer formations could be used in a coordinated counterstroke against the Soviet forces. Hitler's decision now meant that von Manstein could begin preparations for the counterstroke. By the middle of February, the Voronezh front had torn a huge gap in the German line between Belgorod and Lysychansk, through which 6 Soviet armies were heading for the Dnieper and Dnepropetrovsk. The 6th and 1st Guards armies and the Popov group of the southwestern front were streaming through the gap between Kharkov and the left flank of 1st Panzer Army in the general direction of Pavlograd. The redeployment of the 1st and 4th Panzer armies was interpreted by Stalin as a strategic withdrawal. And so the Soviet Supreme Command ordered the Voronezh front to capture Zaporozhye, thereby cutting off Army Group Don's supply arteries and main line of retreat over the Dnieper via Dnepropetrovsk.
Ja, ich war ein junger Leutnant und kam.
Yes, I was a young lieutenant and came back from hospital having been wounded to join my division, which was in Stalingrad. But I only got as far as Rostov on the Don. We naturally didn't know what was happening. But we saw that there were big movements in progress there, and that the enemy was putting increasing pressure on Rostov so as to close this narrow bottleneck.
Engen Flaschenhals zuzumachen. Wir wurden dann zusammengefasst.
Then we were gathered together and had to stop advancing Soviet forces in the northern suburbs of Rostov. And we noted that the Soviets were pushing even further to the northwest, in the direction of the middle Dnieper. One noticed that no more trains were coming, and we had to wait to load our vehicles, so that we could return to Germany to be reformed.
Despite their successes, the troops of the Voronezh front had suffered heavy losses and were beginning to outrun their supply services, which had to struggle for hundreds of kilometers over bad roads. Popov's mechanized group swung south and headed for Krasnoarmeysk. Lanz Kampfforce on the left flank of Army Group Don, now renamed Army Group South, was ordered south to delay the Soviet advance in the direction of Poltava and hold Kharkov as long as possible without allowing itself to be encircled. However, commander of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, General Paul Hauser, was not prepared to sacrifice his corps, and despite Hitler's direct order to hold the city, he allowed the Soviets to retake it on the 14th of February. As the panzer formations moved from north to south to their forming up positions for the counterstroke, this left virtually no mobile reserves in the center of the southern front. In the south, 1st Panzer Army was trying to stop Popov in the area around Slavyansk. Fighting had also flared up in Holit Forces sector on the Mius front. Hitler chose the 17th of February to make one of his rare visits to the front to discuss the critical situation with von Manstein and try to resolve their differences of opinion on the conduct of the campaign. Hitler was preoccupied with the retention of the industrial region of the Donetsk Basin and Kharkov. Manstein argued that such objectives were irrelevant as long as the Red Army remained undefeated in the field. While Hitler demanded the recapture of Kharkov, von Manstein explained that the further west the Soviets penetrated, the more effective would be his counterstroke. All von Manstein demanded was the opportunity to concentrate his panzer forces, even if it meant temporarily giving up ground to the Soviets. When next day Hitler flew back to Rastenburg, von Manstein was relieved to see him go. He had secured Hitler's agreement to his operational plan, and it had been reported that Soviet tanks were only 60 kilometers away and there were no German units to stop them.
About the 20th of February, the situation became critical. The enemy had broken through the Mius front at 2 points. They had advanced across the Donets on the right flank of the 1st Panzer Army, and our army detachment in the north, under Kempf, had lost a great deal of ground.
Although heavily outnumbered, in some places by as much as 8 to 1, von Manstein had the following forces to redeploy in order to regain the initiative. Kampfforce, 4th Panzer Army with 2nd SS Panzer Corps, 48th Panzer Corps, and remnants of 57th Panzer Corps. 1st Panzer Army with 40th Panzer Corps, 3rd Panzer Corps, and Holit Force, totaling 9 panzer divisions, 2 Panzer Grenadier, and a number of German infantry divisions, and remnants of Italian and Romanian units. Field Marshal von Manstein's primary aim was to destroy the enemy, which had crossed the Donetsk River by a counterstroke beginning on the 19th of February. Kampfforce was to attack southwards and delay the right flank of the 6th Soviet Guards Army in the area forward of Poltava and cover the deep flank of the attacking 4th Panzer Army. Directly in the path of 1st Guards Army's main thrust at Dnipropetrovsk was 48th Panzer Corps and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps of the 4th Panzer Army, whose task was to attack the enemy flanks in the gap between Kampfforce and 1st Panzer Army and reach the Donetsk west of Izum. 1st Panzer Army was to attack northeastwards and destroy Popov's group, and then advance to the Donetsk east of Izum. Holit Force was to hold the Mius position from Taganrog to northeast of Stalino. The snow-covered Ukrainian soil was hard, and only villages offered any shelter or concealment. At night, it was often minus 15 degrees centigrade. The terrain was open and undulating, intersected by frozen brooks. Visibility in good weather was from 13 to 20 kilometers.
Der 21. Februar
The turning point came on the 21st of February. The Mius front was holding. The enemy units which had broken through were encircled, and the attacks against our front line had subsided. The enemy attack across the Donets on the right flank of the 1st Panzer Army was contained.
1st Panzer Army, with 11th Panzer Division under the command of Lieutenant General Hermann Balk, together with 7th Panzer and 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, engaged Popov's group at Kramatorsk. After a week of hard fighting, Popov's group had been severely mauled by 1st Panzer Army. On its right flank, Balk was anxious to disengage his 16 tanks and attack the rear of Popov's main force, which had been halted south of Stepanovka and was running out of supplies. The deep snow made rapid movement difficult, but Balk managed to organize some snow plows. On each, he put an energetic officer and sent them off across the steppe in a southerly direction. 2 hours later, 11th and parts of 7th Panzer Division crossed Popov's line of advance and ploughed through the group's rear services. On a wide front, the panzers passed through Kramatorsk in their advance towards Novotroitskoye, where a fierce battle was raging. This attack from a totally unexpected direction signaled the end of Popov's group, and its remnants were chased back across the river Toryets, where they held out in the town of Barvienkovo. The first attempt to dislodge the Soviets was repulsed.
Am Nachmittag bekam ich dann den Befehl, dass ich den Ort zu nehmen hätte.
And in the afternoon I received orders to take the village. So I ordered my company to get moving and take it. But since we knew that it was full of tanks and Russians, no one moved.
Panzer steckt voller Russischer, fuhr kein Mensch. Daraufhin habe ich erstmal nochmal mit dem Regiment.
So I contacted my regimental commander again and said, "This village now, how can we do it?" He replied, "Strachwitz, how you do it, I have no idea. The only thing I can tell you is that you've got to take it."
Und daraufhin habe ich meiner Kompanie gesagt,
So I told my company, "I shall go first. We shall drive across the open country downhill as fast as tanks can go into the village, and each of you will get behind a house. Then we shall see what the Russians are going to do, what the resistance is like, and what is coming up." And we did just that.
Und das machten wir auch. Ich fuhr als
I took the lead, since probably if I hadn't, no one would have moved at all. And we did 75 kilometers an hour. I've never driven so fast in a tank before or since as I did over that open country. And this must have been a frightfully impressive sight for the Russians in the village, since every tank had a great cloud of snow behind it, which whirled and whirled round and round. So we drove into the village, and each tank got behind a house. My gun projected into a window, and we couldn't drive any further. And then we discovered that, at the same speed with which we had driven in, the Russians had beaten it on the other side, and without firing a shot. No one fired at all, neither we nor the Russians. It was by genuine chance that the Russians lost their nerve. Otherwise they would have made mincemeat of us.
Den 21. Februar.
The turning point came about the 21st of February. The enemy units which had broken through on the Mius front were bottled up. The attack across the Donets on the right flank of the 1st Panzer Army had been contained, and the 4th Panzer Army had achieved a notable victory at Pavlograd and beaten and partly destroyed those enemy units which had advanced a long way to the southwest. This eliminated the threat which we had faced at the Dniepr crossings. As from that moment, both the Field Marshal and I were confident that we would achieve the objective we had set ourselves. The situation continued to improve until the 2nd of March, because the Russians had weakened in their confrontation with the 1st Panzer Army. They retreated across the Donets so that we were able to give the order on the 28th of February for the attack on Kharkov.
Whilst 1st Panzer Army was destroying the Popov group in the areas of Grishino and Kramatorsk, the 4th Panzer Army with 4 panzer divisions attacked northwards, taking the Soviets by surprise. The 17th Panzer Division, commanded by General Fridolin, von Zenger and Etterlin, on the right flank of 4th Panzer Army, reached the Donetsk between Izum and Balakleya. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps on the left flank encountered little resistance until it approached Kharkov and established contact with Kempf Force on its left. Field Marshal von Manstein now began the destruction of the Soviet forces in the Kharkov area. By the 10th of March, 2nd SS Panzer Corps was sweeping round the north of Kharkov into the rear of the enemy forces facing 48th Panzer Corps. To make up for its precipitous withdrawal from Kharkov a month earlier, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps could not resist the opportunity to retake the city on the 14th of March. On the following day, Chuguyev fell to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and the Soviets found their main line of retreat blocked. To protect his northern flank, von Manstein ordered his 4th Panzer Army to seize Belgorod, which fell to the 1st SS Panzer Division by a coup de main on the 18th of March.
Das Ergebnis des Gegenschlags kann man mit einem...
The result of the counterstroke can be summed up in a single sentence: the salvation of the entire southern front in the campaign in the east. The old position on the Donets, held in the winter of 1941 to 1942, was reconstituted as a result of it. The enemy forces which had broken through were smashed, and they lost hundreds of tanks and guns, and thousands as prisoners. In addition, the muddy period which was setting in brought the whole southern front once again to a firm halt.
In studying once again the sequence of events shown in the maps, it is possible to look through the tangle of arrows and see the brilliant simplicity of Field Marshal von Manstein's concept. The Soviets misread his redeployment of forces as a strategic withdrawal, and in their eagerness to repeat their success at Stalingrad, they overreached themselves. As the Soviet armored spearheads pierced the Axis lines and ranged far and wide over the steppe, they left their supply columns far behind, and then, just as a decisive victory was within their grasp, they ran out of fuel. The German retreat suddenly stopped, turned about, and transformed itself into a powerful, carefully coordinated and devastating counterstroke. Because it fell between Germany's two great defeats, Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk, the counterstroke has been overshadowed until recently by those disasters. But today it is seen as one of Germany's greatest military achievements.
Military history does not repeat itself, and therefore lessons can only be drawn from it with great care. Even so, it is important to understand today what those weaknesses were and how they were exploited by the German side in order to fulfill their mission of strategic defense. First, there was the immature and inflexible command and control system of the Soviets. They needed a long time to prepare their offensive operations. These were set out in phases and with intermediate objectives in great detail. Everything was pre-planned, and so there was no flexibility at lower levels of command. The lack of cooperation between different arms within the Soviet army on the battlefield was another weakness. Each arm had tended to develop independently and without integration. Thus, for example, the Soviets possessed no mechanized or armored infantry, and their soldiers advancing on foot could therefore easily be separated from their attacking tanks. And in contrast to this, the German side had a very well tried command and control system, which through the concept of directives rather than specific orders allowed the greatest possible room for maneuver to a subordinate commander, right down to the individual tank commander. The core of the counterstroke were the fully armored brigade-sized task forces. of battle tanks, armored infantry, armored artillery, armored engineers, whose vulnerability was very small, but whose mobility was high. The commander of such a task force combined shock action and firepower for the counterstroke. The counterstroke, as the film illustrated, was the principal element in the mobile defensive battle at the tactical and operational levels. Its key characteristic, in contrast to the counterattack, was that it was directed spontaneously against an enemy in the process of his advancing, and therefore an enemy not well situated or prepared to defend himself. It could hardly be pre-planned, but relied instead on seizing the advantage of a given situation whenever the enemy's weaknesses could best be exploited in order to destroy him.